The year was 1457, and winter hung heavy over Pembroke Castle, the winds howling against its stone walls like restless spirits. Inside, the air was thick not with frost but with the piercing cries of a child, though not the cries of a babe, not yet. These were the ragged, anguished sobs of Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 years old, her small frame bent beneath a torment that seemed far too cruel for her tender age. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, the sweat of pain mixing with tears that would not cease. Midwives clustered around her, their voices urgent, their hands stained with the evidence of a struggle that had stretched now into its 18th hour. They whispered prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron of childbirth, begging for her intercession. A single candle guttered in the draught, its wavering flame casting shadows across the stone chamber, as though even light itself trembled at the sight. "Push, my lady. For the love of God, push," one of the women urged, though the girl's body seemed broken, too frail to summon any more strength. Every breath tore through her chest like glass. Each wave of agony threatened to extinguish her consciousness. She was not ready. She was not meant for this. But fate is a ruthless master, and Margaret Beaufort had been born not to live as a child but to serve as the vessel of dynasties. Margaret's mind drifted in and out of delirium. In moments of fleeting clarity, she clung to the edge of her faith, whispering fragments of psalms between sobs. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She had been taught from infancy that suffering purified the soul, that endurance brought one closer to Christ. But at 13, such lofty words rang hollow. How could God's mercy dwell in this chamber of screams and blood? Her thoughts flickered to Edmund Tudor, her husband, her captor, her stranger. Married at 12, widowed at 13, she now bore his child as both burden and curse. He was gone, dead of plague or treachery, and she was left to carry his legacy within her. A legacy that tore at her insides like a blade. The midwives exchanged grave glances. The child would not come. Margaret's body, small and unformed, resisted nature's violent demand. They resorted to desperate measures, herbs and oils, whispered charms as old as the hills. A relic, a scrap of cloth said to have touched the Virgin shrine at Walsingham, was pressed to her chest. Yet still the hours bled away, and with each contraction her cries grew weaker. One whispered to another, too softly for Margaret to hear, "If she lives, she may never bear another. Her womb is too young, too narrow. This birth will break her." The castle itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside the chamber, soldiers of Jasper Tudor, her brother-in-law and guardian, paced with restless unease. For in the bowels of Pembroke, they all knew what hung in the balance. The child she carried was no ordinary babe. He was of the blood of Lancaster, the last fragile thread of a dynasty unraveling in the wars that engulfed England. If he lived, hope might live with him. If both mother and child perished, a lineage would be extinguished in that very hour. Margaret herself did not think of dynasties. She thought only of survival. Between waves of pain, she found her lips forming prayers, not for crowns or power, but for deliverance. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." She repeated it until the words blurred into nonsense, until only the rhythm remained, a lifeline to something beyond her torment. Then it came, a final surge, a tearing agony beyond description, a scream that ripped through the chamber like the sound of a soul being wrenched from flesh. And then silence. The silence of a body collapsed. The silence of attendants holding breath. And then, piercing that dreadful stillness, the thin, frail cry of a newborn child. The midwife held him aloft, slick with blood, wailing against the chill air. "A boy," she whispered, her voice cracking with both awe and dread. "A son. A son. A child born of agony, destined for destiny." They placed the infant in Margaret's trembling arms. Her vision blurred, her strength near spent, she looked upon him through a haze of exhaustion. His face, so small, so fragile, seemed almost unreal. She whispered a name, barely audible. "Henry. Henry Tudor." In that instant, history pivoted. Though no one in the chamber could have foreseen it, though Margaret herself could not grasp it through the fog of her pain, the boy who had just taken his first breath would one day seize a crown torn from blood and betrayal. He would become Henry VII, founder of a new dynasty, the House of Tudor. But for Margaret, there was no triumph, only emptiness. Her body was shattered. She had given everything she had to bring this child into the world, and in return, she was left hollowed. As the midwives tended to her, whispering that she should rest, she felt a terrible finality settle in her bones. She was 13, and her womb was ruined. She would never bear another child. This boy, this Henry, was both her only son and her only chance. In that realization, something hardened within her. She clutched him tighter, her cracked lips pressing against his damp forehead. Her body was broken, her childhood stolen, but her spirit would not bend. If she had only one son, then he would not be forgotten, not be lost, not be crushed beneath the ruin of Lancaster. And so it was in that frozen Welsh castle that Margaret Beaufort, child, widow, mother, was transformed. Not merely by the act of birth, but by the resolve forged in agony. She would become more than a survivor. She would become a strategist, a schemer, a woman whose faith and ferocity would shape the fate of kingdoms. But for now, in that chamber heavy with blood and candle smoke, she was only a girl holding a crying babe, whispering through cracked lips, "You will live, my son. Whatever it costs me, you will live." And in that vow, the Tudor dynasty began. The newborn Henry slept fitfully, swaddled in rough linen, his breath shallow, his cry faint. He was alive, but fragile, as though the violence of his entry into the world had left its mark not only upon his mother, but upon him as well. The midwives feared he would not survive his first winter. Yet for Margaret Beaufort, watching the rise and fall of that tiny chest, his survival was not merely hope, it was necessity. Her body had been broken by childbirth. The truth was whispered among the women who had witnessed it. Margaret could never again endure another pregnancy. She was, at 13, finished. The single child she had borne, this son, this Henry, was all she would ever have. Her only fruit, her only chance, her only weapon. And so a bond was forged, fierce and unyielding. While other noble mothers might have entrusted their infants to wet nurses and tutors, Margaret clung to her son with an intensity born of desperation. She could not nurse him herself, her body too frail, but she oversaw every detail of his care, every breath he drew, every moment of his fragile existence. If he cried, she was at his side. If he coughed, her heart raced with terror. She began to see the hand of Providence upon him, fragile though he seemed. For why else would God have allowed her to endure such torment, if not to bring forth a life destined for some higher purpose? Yet Henry was not simply the son of Margaret Beaufort. He was the heir of Lancaster. Through his mother, he carried the bloodline of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, a claim to royal lineage that made him dangerous in a kingdom tearing itself apart. And through his late father, Edmund Tudor, he bore the connection to Wales, to the Tudors who had risen from obscurity to prominence by royal favor. It was a dangerous inheritance. England in the 1450s was a kingdom in chaos. The Wars of the Roses, those bitter, bloody conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, were already tearing the realm into pieces. Every nobleman declared loyalty with one hand and betrayal with the other. Every child born with royal blood was not merely a blessing but a threat. And so, even as Margaret prayed over her infant son, forces beyond her control were already measuring his worth. Henry's guardian became his uncle, Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, brother to his late father. Jasper was no ordinary nobleman. He was bold, restless, and fiercely loyal to the Lancastrian cause. To him, the infant Henry was not merely a nephew. He was a symbol, a future claimant, a boy who might one day unite Lancastrian hopes in their darkest hour. Jasper swore to protect the child with his life. Yet protection meant separation. When Henry was barely able to walk, decisions were made. Decisions Margaret was powerless to stop. The boy was sent to live under Jasper's care, raised not as a mother's son but as a ward of politics, shuttled between castles as the wars raged. Margaret was forced to watch as her child slipped from her arms into the hands of men who saw him less as a boy and more as a pawn. Her heart broke with every farewell. She was still a teenager herself, yet she lived already as one accustomed to loss. She had lost her childhood, her husband, her health, and now she lost the daily presence of her son. All that remained was her determination. If she could not raise him by her side, then she would shape the world around him. She would weave alliances, cultivate influence, and bend her life to the singular purpose of ensuring Henry's survival. Margaret's world became one of strategy cloaked in prayer. She attended Mass with fervor, her lips moving ceaselessly in whispered devotions, her hands tracing the crucifix as though etching its promise into her very skin. Yet even in the pews, her mind worked like a general's. Which noble families might be swayed? Which marriages arranged? Which loyalties purchased? Others underestimated her. She was small, frail, and pious, seemingly harmless. But beneath the veil of meek devotion lay a mind sharpened by suffering. Margaret had learned early that power did not belong only to men who wielded swords. It also belonged to those who understood people, faith, and fear. And she understood all three. Still, even Margaret's iron will could not shield her from the tides of war. The Lancastrians faltered. King Henry VI, weak and prone to madness, lost his throne to the brilliant and ruthless Edward IV of York. Battles were fought, castles besieged, loyalties betrayed. Jasper Tudor fled into exile, and young Henry, still only a boy, was forced to scatter with him, carried from one fortress to another like a treasure too valuable to be lost. For Margaret, each rumor was a dagger. Was her son still alive? Had he fallen into Yorkist hands? The thought of him imprisoned, or worse, executed, was a terror she could scarcely endure. She fasted, she prayed, she bargained with God in the silence of her chambers. Spare him, Lord. Take all from me, but spare him. At times, news reached her that he was safe, hidden in remote Welsh strongholds. At other times, silence. Silence more dreadful than any lie. It was in these years that Margaret's faith crystallized into something unbreakable. She began to believe that God had chosen Henry for greatness, that his very survival in the midst of chaos was a sign of divine favor. She told herself again and again that the boy's destiny was written, that he would live to see a crown upon his head. And if destiny required her to sacrifice everything, her peace, her reputation, even her soul, then she would not hesitate. One bitter winter's night, word came that Henry had been spirited across the sea, into Brittany, a boy guest in a foreign court, watched and measured by men who saw his royal blood as both asset and threat. Margaret wept when she heard it, her son cast adrift in a land of strangers. Yet in her heart, she steeled herself. Distance did not matter. Whether in Pembroke or Brittany, her son lived. And while he lived, the fire of her purpose would never be extinguished. Others might see Henry as a pawn in the endless game of kings. Margaret saw him differently. He was not merely a boy, nor even a claimant. He was her covenant with God, her offering of flesh and blood to history. And so she waited, she planned, she endured. Wars rose and fell, kings took and lost crowns, blood was spilled in rivers upon English soil. But always, somewhere, there was Henry, her only son, her only heir, the fragile thread upon which her life's meaning hung. And in her prayers, whispered in the stillness of countless lonely nights, one refrain returned again and again. God has preserved you, Henry, and through you he will preserve us all. The autumn winds carried whispers of war. England's soil had grown accustomed to the tramp of armored feet, to the clash of steel, to the smoke of burning villages. It was a land split in two, Lancaster and York, red rose and white, each claiming the right to rule, each drenched in the blood of the other. Into this storm, Edmund Tudor had marched. Margaret's husband, little more than a boy himself when their union was sealed, had set out under the banner of Lancaster with duty burning in his chest. He was the half-brother of King Henry VI, uncle to a fragile dynasty, and protector of Margaret's inheritance. Though no seasoned warrior, he had the weight of expectation upon his shoulders. But war does not honor bloodlines. It devours them. In November of 1456, Edmund fell captive to Yorkist forces. Imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, he languished in cold stone chambers, disease festering in the air. Some say it was plague that carried him off. Others whisper it was neglect, that his jailers starved him, stripped him of dignity until life itself slipped from his weakened frame. He was 26 years old, and Margaret, barely 13, was left a widow. The news struck like a thunderclap. She was heavy with child, her belly taut with a life that had not yet entered the world, when the tidings came. Her husband gone. The protector of her name, her companion in duty, her son's father, gone. Grief and terror mingled within her. Widowhood meant vulnerability. A pregnant widow meant danger. For in the ruthless game of politics, a woman alone was nothing more than a vessel to be claimed, her estates plundered, her alliances reshaped by those who hungered for power. Margaret understood this even at 13. Her education had not been one of laughter and play but of bloodlines and bargains. She knew that Edmund's death did not merely leave her bereaved. It placed her unborn child in peril. The Tudor name now rested upon an unborn heir. If the child was a boy, he would carry not only the hopes of Margaret but also the Lancastrian cause. If a girl, disappointment would ripple through the family lines, and Margaret's body, damaged by youth and childbirth, might never bear another. When the labor came, it was merciless. The child tore through her too small frame, leaving wounds that would never fully heal. Margaret's screams echoed through the halls of Pembroke Castle, mingling with prayers whispered by midwives who feared for both mother and child. Then, at last, a cry. A boy. Henry Tudor. The midwives swaddled him, pressing him into Margaret's trembling arms. Relief and anguish mingled in her eyes. For in that moment she knew two truths. Her son was alive, and her body was broken. She would bear no more children. Her legacy, her bloodline, her entire purpose, had narrowed to this single fragile boy. Yet motherhood offered no shield from the storms of war. While Margaret recovered in shadowed chambers, Yorkist lords pressed their advantage. Carmarthen, where Edmund had died, remained in their grasp. The Lancastrian cause wavered, its king enfeebled, its nobles fractured. In such a climate, Margaret's newborn son was both treasure and target. It was then that Edmund's brother Jasper Tudor stepped forward. Fierce, loyal, and unrelenting, Jasper understood the stakes. The boy was more than Margaret's child. He was Lancaster's seed, the one thread from which a dynasty might be rewoven. Taking Henry into his care, Jasper swore to guard him as though he were his own blood. Castles, soldiers, and wealth were weapons enough, but Henry was more fragile than either. He was a child whose very existence invited danger. Margaret, still pale from childbirth, clutched Jasper's arm with a grip fierce beyond her years. "Protect him," she whispered. "Swear it." And Jasper swore. But protection often meant separation. As months turned to years, Margaret was forced to surrender her son to Jasper's keeping. The boy would be raised among soldiers, priests, and courtiers, shifting from fortress to fortress as the wars demanded. Each time Jasper moved, Henry moved with him. For Margaret, this was agony. She had given life to her son through torment. Now she gave him up for survival. Letters passed between them when they could, words of devotion inked with trembling hands. But ink was not touch. Parchment was not the warmth of a child's cheek. She lived in absence, consoling herself with prayer, whispering the same refrain night after night. "God has preserved you for a reason. Live, my son. Live." Meanwhile, England's fate staggered between blood-soaked battlefields. At Towton, snow turned red with slaughter as York triumphed, scattering Lancastrian hopes like leaves in the wind. King Henry VI fled. Queen Margaret of Anjou fought on with the fury of a lioness protecting her cub. And in the shadows, the child Henry Tudor grew, nameless to the people, yet dangerous to kings. To Yorkists, he was a threat, a bloodline that refused to die. To Lancastrians, he was a beacon, a promise that the red rose might yet bloom again. To his mother, he was everything. But a pawn in the game of kings is rarely left untouched. The boy's fate shifted again when Jasper's fortunes waned. Yorkist power tightened its grip, and Jasper was forced into exile. Henry, still little more than a child, was seized, passed into the custody of Yorkist lords who measured his value like coin. To kill him would risk martyring him. To keep him alive meant wielding him like a bargaining chip. Margaret's prayers grew frantic. She could not reach him. She could not hold him. She could only kneel in candlelight, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled, pleading for divine mercy. Her mind, however, did not rest with prayer alone. She began to weave threads of intrigue, reaching cautiously through correspondence, forging ties with nobles who might shield her son, whispering promises of loyalty and reward if Henry should one day rise. Others underestimated her. Small, devout, and cloaked in widow's black. But Margaret Beaufort was not simply a grieving mother. She was becoming something more. In those years of loss and distance, she learned the hardest lesson of all. Power was not granted. It was seized. And so the widow of Edmund Tudor, still scarcely a woman grown, vowed that she would carve a future for her son, even if she had to outwit kings, endure exile, and cloak herself in a lifetime of sacrifice. Henry's father had fallen. His future was uncertain. But as long as Margaret Beaufort drew breath, his cause would not die. For in her heart burned a faith stronger than fear, and a resolve sharper than any sword. And that resolve would change the course of English history. The Wars of the Roses did not merely decide battles on muddy fields. They seeped into the bedchambers and halls of power, where alliances were forged not only by bloodshed but by marriage. And in this ruthless game, Margaret Beaufort became a piece on the board. Moved, bartered, and bound by vows she did not choose. Widowed at 13, her body scarred by childbirth, Margaret might have expected her life to be cloistered, a solemn retreat into widowhood. Yet her youth, her lineage, and her vast inheritance made her far too valuable to be left idle. The guardians of her fortune, the king's men, saw in her not a grieving child, but a prize to be claimed. For in England, heiresses were currency. And Margaret Beaufort, sole bearer of the Beaufort bloodline, was wealth beyond measure. The first to seize that prize was none other than Sir Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham. At 14, Margaret was married again, her second union, her will irrelevant, her fate signed in contracts inked by men. Henry Stafford was not cruel. He was steady, pragmatic, and older by nearly 2 decades. To him, Margaret was not a wife in the tender sense of companionship. She was an alliance, a bridge between his house and the precarious fortunes of Lancaster. Margaret, however, approached her role with the gravity of a woman far older than her years. She kept household accounts with meticulous care. She tended to her estates, learned the languages of power, negotiation, patronage, and diplomacy. She understood that her survival lay not in resisting the game but in mastering it quietly, from within. But the battlefield never released its grip. In 1461, Edward of York seized the throne, crowning himself Edward IV. The Lancastrian cause crumbled. Margaret's world, her son's world, trembled. For if Edward's power solidified, Henry Tudor's bloodline would mean not hope, but threat. Margaret clung to her marriage with Stafford as to a fragile shield. Unlike Jasper Tudor, who still fought in exile, Stafford bent his knee to York. For a time, this loyalty protected them. Margaret learned the art of silence, of wearing neutrality like armor. Yet even in compromise, she never forgot her son. Henry was in the custody of Yorkist lords now, far from her embrace. Every decision she made, every gesture of obedience to Edward IV, was calculated for one purpose: to keep her child alive. In 1471, the war flared anew. Lancaster rallied, bringing exiled forces and foreign support. Margaret's hopes lifted. Could her son's cause yet rise? Her husband chose differently. Henry Stafford marched to Barnet under the Yorkist banner. There, in April's mist, battle raged with chaos and betrayal. Arrows darkened the sky, swords clashed, men fell in heaps. When the smoke cleared, the Lancastrians were broken once more. Edward IV was secure upon his throne, and Henry Stafford was grievously wounded. Carried from the field, bloodied and broken, he lingered only a few months before death claimed him. Margaret was a widow once more, this time at 28. Twice married, twice widowed, twice bereaved. But she did not weep as she had at 13. She had grown sharper in her suffering. She understood now that marriages were not bonds of love, but contracts of survival. If she wished to safeguard her son, she must wield them as weapons. The chance came swiftly. Her cousin, Thomas, Lord Stanley, one of the shrewdest men in England, extended his hand. Stanley was powerful, wealthy, a master of navigating the tides of war. He bent with York when York was strong, yet never so low that he could not rise again if fortune shifted. To Margaret, he was no romantic choice. But he was protection, influence, and the possibility of maneuvering her son closer to safety. And so, Margaret Beaufort married Thomas Stanley. With this union, she secured not only a husband but a platform, a place at court where whispers moved faster than swords. Stanley's position gave her access to the very halls where Edward IV ruled. She walked those corridors not as a supplicant but as a participant, cloaked in the dignity of her rank, her eyes watchful, her words measured. It was here, in the glittering but perilous court of Edward IV, that Margaret's transformation deepened. No longer merely a pawn shuffled between players, she began to move herself, quietly, carefully, across the board. Yet the danger never ceased. Her son, Henry Tudor, remained abroad in Brittany under the wary eyes of foreign dukes. Margaret pressed constantly for news, negotiating in secret, planting seeds of loyalty among nobles who might one day rally to his cause. But she knew Edward IV was no fool. The king watched her with suspicion, aware that her loyalty might be but a mask. Margaret wore that mask well. She attended court, honored the queen, even forged a cautious rapport with Edward's mother-in-law, the formidable Cecily Neville. She prayed in chapels, distributed alms, and cultivated the image of a devout, harmless woman. But beneath the veil of piety, her mind worked ceaselessly. In marriage to Stanley, she learned the art of subtle influence. Stanley's genius was survival, never committing so fully to one side that he could not pivot to the other. Margaret watched, studied, and refined the skill for herself. She began to see marriage not as her cage, but as her cloak. With Stanley's power shielding her, she could plot unseen, maneuver where others would dismiss her. Yet always, her heart turned back to her son. For every vow she spoke, every compromise she made, every role she played, it was for him. Henry was the future. Henry was the reason. And one day, she swore, the pawn would become Queen Mother. By the time Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, Margaret was no longer a child tossed about by men's ambitions. She had endured widowhood, war, and the cold bargaining of marriages. She had bent but not broken, survived but not surrendered. Now, as the kingdom plunged again into chaos, Margaret Beaufort stood ready. The pawn had learned the board, and soon she would dare to play her own game. Marriage, in 15th century England, was not the promise of affection. It was a transaction, a contract of blood, land, and loyalty. For a girl like Margaret Beaufort, heiress to the Beaufort fortune, marriage was never a matter of choice. It was inevitability. And so it was, before she even understood what it meant to be a wife, that Margaret found herself promised, first to one man, then to another, as though she were no more than a jewel passed from hand to hand. The year was 1455. Margaret was barely 12 when the decision was made. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, had fought to preserve her daughter's inheritance, but in the halls of power, no woman, especially not a widowed mother, could stand against the will of the king. Henry VI's council decided Margaret must be married, and swiftly. The chosen groom was Edmund Tudor, half-brother to the king. Edmund was no callow youth but a man in his mid-20s, seasoned by war, ambitious, eager to consolidate his place in the turbulent politics of Lancaster and York. For him, the match was a triumph. By wedding Margaret, he secured not only wealth but the legitimacy of Beaufort blood. For Margaret it was bewilderment. Picture her, a thin girl with solemn eyes, scarcely tall enough to carry the weight of her gowns. She had been reared with piety, instructed in prayer and the reading of devotional texts. She knew her catechism, the stories of saints, the discipline of silence. She did not yet know the language of womanhood. And yet, before the ink was dry on the marriage contract, she was called bride. At 12, Margaret Beaufort stood at the altar beside a stranger twice her age. The vows were recited, the hands joined, the blessing spoken. Those who witnessed the union did not see a child, they saw a dynastic triumph. But within Margaret, fear trembled. She had no illusions. She was stepping into a role she had not chosen, into a life that was no longer her own. The months that followed blurred with uncertainty. Edmund claimed his rights as husband swiftly. The law permitted it, though the church frowned on consummating unions with child brides. But Edmund Tudor was not inclined to wait. Margaret, still fragile in body, was thrust into the woman's role before her frame was ready. The experience was not tenderness, but duty. Not affection, but necessity. In Margaret's later years, when she reflected on the bruising weight of her early marriage, she would remark with grave understatement that she had been barely able to bear what was required of her. And soon, the consequence of that consummation was upon her. At 13, Margaret Beaufort was with child. The belly swelled before she had even ceased to be a child herself. Her bones, her hips, her frame, all unready. The danger was palpable, whispered among midwives and servants. Many thought she would not survive. Her mother wept in private. Her attendants prayed. But for Margaret, there was no choice but endurance. She turned, as she always would, to God. Long hours she spent on her knees in chapel, whispering prayers that mingled with tears, bargaining with heaven for strength. Lord, let this suffering not be in vain. Spare me, that I may serve you still. Before the child was born, tragedy struck. Edmund Tudor, her husband, was seized during the Yorkist advance in 1456. Imprisoned at Carmarthen, he sickened of plague and died, leaving Margaret widowed before her 14th birthday. Now she was a girl again, cloistered in mourning, yet with a life stirring inside her. The halls that once rang with Edmund's ambition fell silent. The banners lowered. Margaret walked them not as a wife but as a widow heavy with child. At 13, she was forced to prepare not only for motherhood but for survival in widowhood. The birth came in the cold of January 1457, at Pembroke Castle. Labor tore her body, wrenching hours of agony from a frame too narrow for its burden. The midwives feared she would perish. So did Margaret herself. But she clung fiercely to prayer, whispering words between screams. And when at last the cries of a newborn echoed in the chamber, Margaret fainted into exhausted silence. A son. He was named Henry Tudor. The child survived. Margaret survived, barely. The birth left her frail, her body altered forever by the ordeal. She would never again conceive, never again bear another child. At 13, she had given life once, and that once would be enough to shape the destiny of England. Motherhood came upon her as suddenly as marriage. Yet even here, the role was snatched from her hands. The care of her son was entrusted not to her, but to others, guardians appointed by the crown, men who saw Henry as a political asset to be controlled. Margaret was permitted glimpses, supervised visits, the brief intimacy of a mother's embrace stolen from the gaze of courtiers. Each time she held him, she whispered blessings into his ear, soft words he was too young to understand. You are my hope, my heart. You will live the life I was denied. God has spared us both for his purpose. But as soon as she uttered them, the child would be taken from her arms once more. Widowhood at 13, motherhood before 14. Margaret Beaufort bore in her small body the paradox of her age. She was still a child, yet forced into the gravest responsibilities of womanhood. Where others of her years played in meadows or whispered girlish secrets, Margaret wrote careful letters to protect her estates, bargained with stewards, and learned to guard her son's inheritance with a tenacity beyond her age. And though history might paint her as calculating, even cold, the truth is this: she was fighting with the only weapon she had. Her prayers, her resilience, her obedience turned into quiet defiance. Every marriage forced upon her, every role thrust upon her. Margaret bore them not as a victim, but as a vessel of endurance. For in that fragile child she bore at Pembroke, destiny stirred. Henry Tudor, son of a girl mother and a half-royal father, would one day seize the crown of England. But in 1457 no one could know. All that was certain was that Margaret Beaufort, bride of a stranger, child in a woman's role, had endured the fire, and from it carried both scars and a legacy. The candles had barely burned down in the chamber where her son drew his first breath when the news reached Margaret. Edmund Tudor, her husband, was gone. The plague had swept through Carmarthen, where he languished as a prisoner of the Yorkists. By the time the messengers arrived, it was too late. Edmund, ambitious, forceful, the man who had claimed her as his child bride, was dead. Margaret, not yet 14, was a widow. Widowhood in 15th century England was no gentle mantle. It was a precarious state, an exposed position on the chessboard of politics. To be widowed young, with a newborn child, was to stand as prey before the wolves of ambition. Margaret understood this instinctively. She had been bred in the courts of power, tutored by her mother in the art of survival. Yet the reality struck with icy force. The man who had bound her to the Lancastrian cause was gone, and in his place she held only an infant, an heir without a protector. Her son, Henry, was barely days old when he became fatherless, and Margaret, scarcely more than a child herself, was left to shield him with nothing but her wits and her prayers. The corridors of Pembroke Castle grew heavy with silence. Edmund's retainers dispersed, seeking service with stronger lords. The banners of Tudor lowered. The hall emptied of the man's commanding presence. Where once Margaret had walked beside him in awe and trepidation, now she moved alone, a thin figure wrapped in black. At night, when the castle walls groaned with winter winds, she would rise from her bed and pace the chapel, her rosary beads clutched tightly, her lips moving in whispers. "Lord, you have taken him, but leave me my son. Let Henry live. Let me live, that I may raise him." But even as she prayed, she knew her child's future was not hers to command. The crown seized Henry Tudor into its wardship almost at once. He was the son of Edmund Tudor, nephew to King Henry VI, too valuable to be left in his mother's arms. His guardianship passed into the hands of men appointed by the crown, men whose loyalty could be bought, men who saw in the infant not a boy, but a title, an inheritance, a pawn. Margaret was granted glimpses of her son, short moments in which she could cradle him and murmur words he would never remember. Then he would be carried away, entrusted to keepers, and she would be left with the aching emptiness of absence. At 13, she had given her body to childbirth, her youth to marriage, her husband to death, and her son to politics. And yet she endured. Margaret's strength did not lie in open defiance. It lay in endurance, in quiet persistence. She watched, listened, learned. Widowhood had stripped her of protection, but it had also taught her a fierce independence. She became sharper, quicker in judgment, shrewder in letters. Her household, though modest, was managed with precision. She studied the shifting tides of Lancaster and York, marking each turn of fortune. And in all things, she anchored herself in piety. Prayer became not only her solace but her weapon. When courtiers underestimated her, when lords dismissed her as a child widow, she bent her will toward heaven. She sought not escape but purpose. Still, the shadow of fear hung close. Rumors of the Wars of the Roses seeped into every hall. Battles flared, St. Albans, Blore Heath, Ludford Bridge, and with each, the Lancastrian cause grew more precarious. Margaret knew her son's blood tied him to that cause. If the Yorkists triumphed, Henry would be hunted, dispossessed, perhaps even destroyed. The thought haunted her nights. Her baby's fragile body broken by a world that cared nothing for innocence. And so she prayed all the harder. Widowhood forced Margaret into roles she could never have imagined. At an age when most girls played at dolls or embroidered in girlish company, Margaret dictated letters to stewards, bargained over rents, and calculated dowries. She could not afford naivety. Each signature she placed, each seal she pressed into wax, was a step in the defense of her son's inheritance. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, stood beside her as best she could, guiding her with steady counsel. But even the elder Margaret could not shield her daughter from the machinations of men. Lords circled like hawks, eyeing both the child widow and the infant heir. For though Edmund Tudor was dead, his widow remained a prize. The whispers began before her mourning gowns had faded. Margaret Beaufort must marry again. Her youth, her wealth, her bloodline, all demanded it. She was too valuable to be left unclaimed. And so, scarcely had she buried her husband when talk turned to her next match. A girl of 13, hollow-eyed from childbirth, still pale from loss, was already measured against the needs of dynasties. Margaret knew she would not be asked for her consent. She never had been. She never would be. But in her heart, she resolved, whatever marriage was forced upon her, she would guard her son. That, above all, was her sacred duty. At Pembroke, with the sea winds lashing the walls, Margaret often stood at the window, gazing out over the grey waters. Somewhere beyond those waves lay France, Burgundy, distant lands that had shaped English politics for decades. She wondered if her son might one day cross those waters, fleeing or conquering, exiled or triumphant. She was too young to foresee it clearly. But she knew with an almost prophetic certainty that Henry was destined for more than the narrow crib in which he now lay. Her life had been consumed by roles she did not choose: child bride, child mother, child widow. But his life might yet change the fate of England. In the meantime, Margaret endured her widowhood with a grace that belied her years. She knelt in chapel, managed her estates, bore the whispers of remarriage, and clutched at the fleeting moments when she was allowed to hold her son. Widowhood at 13 might have broken another girl. For Margaret, it forged her. She would never again be merely a pawn. From the ashes of her first marriage, she rose with a resolve that would carry her through decades of shifting fortune. And though her body still bore the weakness left by childbirth, her spirit had hardened into steel. For Margaret Beaufort, widowhood was not the end. It was the beginning of vigilance, of endurance, of the long, relentless fight for her son's survival. And as the Wars of the Roses bled across England, the child mother who had survived both marriage and loss stood ready to carve her place in the storm. The stone walls of Pembroke Castle stood high and unyielding against the winds that battered the Welsh coast. To many, the fortress was a symbol of Lancastrian loyalty, a strategic outpost in an England torn by civil war. But for Margaret Beaufort, now a widowed girl of 13, Pembroke was more than a fortress. It was a prison, a sanctuary, and a cloister all at once. Within its walls, she learned the meaning of isolation. Her husband's death had stripped her of companionship, but it was her son's wardship that left her most bereft. Henry, her infant boy, belonged not to her but to the crown. Custody of his fragile life lay in the hands of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, a man both loyal and calculating, devoted to the Lancastrian cause. Jasper was not unkind. Indeed, he treated Margaret with courtesy, even with respect unusual for her years. But he made it clear, Henry Tudor was more than her child. He was Lancaster's heir, a living claim to a faltering dynasty. And Margaret, though his mother, was only the vessel through which destiny had passed. The halls of Pembroke were cold, echoing with the voices of men-at-arms and retainers, the clang of weapons, the shuffle of servants. Few women moved through those corridors, and fewer still who shared Margaret's age or station. She was alone, a young widow cloaked in black, drifting through chambers far too large for her fragile presence. The loneliness pressed on her shoulders like a weight. Some nights, when the sea's roar carried through the arrow slits, she would creep into the chapel long after the torches were extinguished. There, before the flickering lamp of the Virgin, she poured out her soul. "Blessed Lady," she whispered, her thin fingers clasping her rosary beads, "I am but a child, yet I am asked to bear so much. Strengthen me, guide me. Let my son live. Let me endure." Her faith became her lifeline. Where others found solace in family or companionship, Margaret turned always to prayer. The rhythm of the Psalms, the soft murmur of Ave Marias, the litanies of saints, all became her companions, her confidants in silence. There were days, however, when even prayer could not shield her from the sting of helplessness. She longed for her child, for Henry's warm breath against her cheek, for the chance to sing him to sleep. But each time she reached out, she was reminded that he was not hers to keep. Jasper's men held him close, and Margaret was allowed only glimpses, enough to stir her maternal ache, never enough to soothe it. She would watch him from a distance, bundled in silks, cradled by nurses, his small fists waving in the air. And though he would never remember, she whispered promises into the air between them. "You are mine, Henry. Whatever they do, whatever they take, I will never cease to fight for you." Outside the walls of Pembroke, the kingdom tore itself apart. The Wars of the Roses raged on, York and Lancaster clashing in fields stained with blood. Rumors drifted into the castle. Victories at Towton for York, reversals for Lancaster, the fragile King Henry VI slipping further into weakness. Margaret listened, absorbed, remembered. Though barely more than a child, she understood that her son's fate was tied to these battles. If Lancaster fell, so too would Henry Tudor's chance at survival. If York triumphed, his very life could be forfeit. Fear, constant and gnawing, shadowed her prayers. But fear was never the end of her story. It was the crucible in which her resolve hardened. Pembroke became her schoolroom, its isolation her teacher. She learned to read men's faces, to hear more in silence than in speech. She studied household accounts, legal documents, and the fine print of inheritance, subjects few girls her age ever touched. For she knew that her survival and Henry's would depend not on beauty or charm but on cunning. She also learned the art of stillness. Where others rushed to voice their thoughts, Margaret mastered restraint. She kept her counsel, spoke little, observed much. Already she sensed that in a world where men played at war and power, her strength would be subtle, concealed, unassuming, yet unbreakable. But if politics sharpened her mind, faith nourished her soul. Margaret's piety was not a passing devotion. It was the marrow of her existence. Every morning, before the castle stirred, she knelt in the chapel, her whispered prayers rising with the incense. Every night, she sought confession, meditation, the comfort of ritual. In her loneliness, she began to see herself as chosen for suffering, an instrument through which God's will might one day unfold. The hardships of marriage, childbirth, widowhood, and separation from her son were not meaningless trials. They were tests, refinements. In later years, those around her would remark on her near-fanatical devotion, her ceaseless prayers, her belief that God had set her apart. But here, in the lonely shadows of Pembroke, those seeds first took root. The seasons passed, and Margaret grew from child to maiden, from maiden to woman, though far faster than nature intended. By the time she turned 14, her face had lost the softness of youth. Her eyes, wide and dark, carried the weight of someone far older. The world beyond Pembroke scarcely remembered she was still a girl. To the nobility, she was a widow of fortune, her vast estates ripe for seizure through remarriage. To Jasper Tudor, she was the guardian of Lancaster's fragile hope. To herself, she was a mother whose arms remained empty. And so, cloistered within the fortress walls, she endured her exile with a patience born not of passivity, but of unyielding faith. There were rare moments of warmth. On clear days, Margaret walked the castle grounds with Jasper, who spoke to her not only of wars but of poetry, of the Welsh bards who sang of ancient heroes. He treated her less as a child, more as a comrade in grief, a young woman bound by duty to the same cause. Yet even Jasper's kindness could not bridge the gulf of her solitude. For while he could ride to battle, Margaret's battlefield was silence. The endless waiting, the prayers whispered into the void, the resolve carved from longing. Isolation at Pembroke might have broken another girl. But for Margaret it tempered her. She emerged from those years leaner in spirit, sharper in thought, anchored more deeply than ever in her faith. She was learning the lesson that would define her life. That power was not always seized in battle. Sometimes it was cultivated in patience, in endurance, in the quiet, relentless shaping of destiny. And though she could not yet see the road ahead, she knew this. Her refuge at Pembroke, her years of loneliness and prayer, were not wasted. They were preparation. For one day, her son would rise from obscurity. And when he did, it would be because she had never ceased to believe, against isolation, against despair, against every force that sought to silence her, that God's hand rested upon them both. The winter of 1457 was bitter, the winds off the Welsh coast rattling the shutters of Pembroke Castle with unrelenting force. Within the stone fortress, fires crackled in every hearth, yet no warmth seemed strong enough to pierce the chill that had settled in Margaret Beaufort's body. She was barely 13 years old, her frame slight, her bones fragile, still more child than woman. Yet now she lay upon the bed of confinement, her young body racked with the agonies of childbirth. Around her bustled midwives and attendants, their voices low and urgent. Jasper Tudor paced in the corridor beyond, unable to enter yet unwilling to retreat. The child about to be born was no ordinary infant. He was a Tudor, son of Edmund, grandson of Owen, great-nephew of Henry VI, and perhaps the last fragile ember of Lancastrian hope. But to Margaret, stripped of politics and titles, he was something far more intimate. Her child. Her only child. The life for which she had prayed through sleepless nights. The son for whom she would endure any pain. The labor was long, agonizing, crueler than any ordeal Margaret could have imagined. Her body, not yet fully grown, fought against the demands placed upon it. The midwives whispered of danger, of the child too large for the narrow hips of so small a mother. Hours stretched into eternity. Margaret clutched the rosary beads pressed into her hand. her knuckles white as she mouthed desperate prayers. "Holy Mother of God, do not forsake me. Let him live. If my body must break, let his be spared." The chamber swirled with heat and pain, the sound of her cries muffled beneath the chant of the midwives urging her to push, to endure, to cling to life. Blood stained the linens. Her vision blurred. Death hovered close, its shadow brushing against her fevered brow. And then, after a final shattering cry, an infant's wail pierced the air. A boy, red-faced, squalling, alive. The midwife swaddled him quickly, holding him up for Jasper, for the attendants, for all who would later swear that a Tudor heir had been born on that winter night. But for Margaret, the world stilled into silence. They laid him against her breast, and for the first time she beheld her son. Henry. His eyes were tightly shut, his fists clenched as though ready to fight the world into which he had so violently arrived. He was fragile, impossibly small, yet to Margaret, he was vast. He was her triumph, her miracle, her reason for survival. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "My son, my precious son." But the joy was laced with sorrow. For though Henry lived, Margaret was broken. The ordeal of childbirth had nearly destroyed her, tearing her body in ways that would leave her weak, marked, and forever unable to bear another child. She was 13, and her womb had fulfilled its purpose in a single brutal act. Henry would be her only child, the lone fruit of her youth, the sole heir to her lineage, the single soul upon whom she would pin all her hopes. The knowledge settled upon her even before the midwives confirmed it. She felt it in her body, hollowed and ruined, a vessel too damaged to ever be filled again. And so, as she cradled Henry, she vowed silently that if she could not give life to another, she would pour every breath, every prayer, every ounce of strength into this one child. Outside the chamber, word spread swiftly. A Tudor heir had been born. To Lancastrian loyalists, it was a glimmer of hope. To Yorkists, a reminder that their enemies still bred resistance. But in the quiet of the birthing room, Margaret thought not of crowns or wars. She thought only of the tiny life pressed against her. She studied his features, searching for traces of Edmund, the husband she had scarcely known and now mourned with every heartbeat. She saw Tudor blood in the set of his face, Beaufort pride in the delicate curve of his brow. Yet more than lineage, she saw promise. Promise that he would live a destiny greater than either of them could yet imagine. Her recovery was slow, painful, haunted by weakness. The castle physicians doubted whether she would rise again. But Margaret, stubborn and devout, clung to life. For Henry's sake she would not surrender. Each day she prayed over his cradle. She traced the sign of the cross on his brow, whispered psalms into his ears, entrusted him to saints and angels. And each night, as the sea winds howled against Pembroke's walls, she held him close, as though by sheer force of love she might shield him from the chaos of the world. Yet even in those first tender weeks, she knew he was not fully hers. Jasper Tudor, ever watchful, ever political, reminded her gently but firmly that Henry was Lancaster's hope. His guardianship extended beyond the walls of the nursery. To Jasper, Henry was the seed of a dynasty, a banner around which loyalists might rally should Lancaster rise again. Margaret listened, nodded, endured. She was young, she was female, she was easily dismissed. Yet beneath her obedient silence burned a fire that would never extinguish. Henry might be Lancaster's heir, but he was also hers. And though she could not ride to battle or shape armies, she would fight in her own way. For his safety, his future, his crown. The winter waned. By spring, Margaret had regained enough strength to walk the castle grounds, Henry bundled in her arms. Servants bowed as she passed, soldiers tipped their heads, but she scarcely noticed. Her gaze was fixed always on her child, her lips murmuring prayers as constant as breath. Already, her identity was dissolving into his. She was not simply Margaret Beaufort. She was the mother of Henry Tudor. And though she was only a girl, though her body remained frail, though the kingdom itself seemed destined for ruin, Margaret felt within her a strange, unshakable certainty. This child, her child, was meant for something greater. That certainty would sustain her through years of loss and exile, through forced marriages and shifting allegiances, through the ever-turning wheel of war. Henry's birth had not only changed her life, It had set the course of England's destiny. And Margaret Beaufort, the child mother who had nearly died to bring him into the world, would never cease to believe that God had chosen them both for a purpose beyond imagining. For in the bleakest winter of her girlhood, amidst pain and blood and fear, the future King of England had drawn his first breath, and with him was born the relentless will of his mother, a force that would one day reshape the crown itself. The weeks after Henry's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and frailty. Margaret Beaufort, barely beyond childhood herself, drifted between moments of maternal tenderness and waves of pain that never seemed to leave her. Her body was broken. The physicians said little, but their silence was more damning than words. She had survived the ordeal of childbirth, yet it had scarred her beyond repair. She would never again endure pregnancy without mortal risk. One child, only one, was all her womb could bear. For a girl of 13 in a noble house, this was both blessing and curse. Her duty had been fulfilled. She had given a son, an heir. But her usefulness as a wife, as a vessel for dynastic ambition, was diminished. The whispers in the corridors of Pembroke Castle carried cruel truths. Fragile, barren, marked by death's hand. And yet Margaret refused to see herself as ruined. Each morning she forced herself to rise from her bed, her frame thin and frail, her steps hesitant. But she walked. She prayed. She cradled her son in her arms, tracing her fingers across his downy brow, whispering promises into his sleeping ear. "You are my purpose, Henry. If God has taken my strength, he has left me you. And for you I will endure anything." The girl who had entered Pembroke as a pawn now carried herself with quiet defiance. Her body had been broken, yes, but her spirit burned with a new and unshakable clarity. It was Jasper Tudor who first noticed the change. He had watched her nearly fade into death upon the birthing bed, watched her cling stubbornly to life with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Now, he saw the same fire in her eyes when she spoke of Henry's future. "This child," she told Jasper one evening, her voice thin but steady, "is not meant to live as a fugitive or pawn. He is meant for greatness. I can feel it as surely as I feel my own breath." Jasper, hardened by war and disillusion, did not dismiss her. He knew better than most that destiny often began in whispers and visions. "Then we must guard him well," he replied, "for the Yorkists would see his blood spilled before he ever learns to walk." Margaret's gaze darkened, her hands tightening around the rosary beads she always carried. "They will not touch him. Not while I live." It was not the vow of a child, nor the hollow boast of a powerless woman. It was the covenant of a mother who had given all she could give and had nothing left to lose but her son. But life did not pause for Margaret's griefs or vows. Already, plans were being made for her remarriage. She was too young, too valuable, and too much of a political tool to remain unwed. Henry's inheritance needed protection, and Margaret herself, though weakened, was still Beaufort, still kin to kings. The prospect filled her with dread. She had scarcely begun to heal from the ravages of childbirth, and now she was to be bound once more, her body bartered for alliances she could not choose. Yet she did not protest. To resist would be futile. Instead, she fixed her thoughts on endurance. If marriage was a cage, then she would learn to live within its bars until the day came when her son could free her. Alone in her chamber, she prayed with fervor that startled even the chaplains who attended her. She prayed not for her own deliverance, but for wisdom, for cunning, for strength of mind. For Margaret had begun to see clearly what others did not. She could not wield swords, nor command armies, nor even promise more heirs. But she could wield her faith. She could wield patience. She could wield the dangerous, invisible weapon of resilience. Her broken body had stripped away her illusions of childhood. Her spirit, honed through suffering, was sharper now than any blade. At night, when Henry slept, she would sit by the flickering light of the fire and trace the lines of her son's face, as though memorizing him. Every sigh, every tiny movement, she held close to her heart. She knew she might be forced to part from him. Noble children were often placed in the keeping of others. The thought was unbearable, yet it hardened her resolve. If she was separated from him, then she would fight from afar. If she was silenced, she would pray louder. If she was caged, she would find cracks in the bars. No power on earth, not Yorkist, not Lancastrian, not even the men who bartered her life, would sever her from her role as Henry's protector. Her frailty, paradoxically, became her shield. Men underestimated her, dismissing her as too meek, too pious, too fragile to be dangerous. They saw her bowed head at chapel and believed she had surrendered. They saw her thin hands folded in prayer and assumed she had no weapons left to draw. But Margaret knew better. The world's scorn gave her cover. Beneath the mask of meekness, she plotted, remembered, and waited. Pain had taught her patience. Loss had taught her calculation. And motherhood had given her a purpose that burned brighter than ambition or fear. Years later, those who opposed her would marvel at her endurance, her cunning, her uncanny ability to outlast every rival. They would call her relentless, manipulative, indomitable. But all of it began here, in the aftermath of her son's birth, when her body was left in ruins and yet her soul refused to yield. Margaret Beaufort was no longer simply a girl who prayed. She had become a woman who endured. On a cold spring morning, as the mists curled around Pembroke's walls, Margaret stood at her window with Henry in her arms. The horizon stretched wide before her, filled with wars she could not yet foresee, dangers she could not yet name. Her body ached. Her future was uncertain. But her spirit, unbroken, lifted like a flame in the wind. "God has given you to me," she whispered into her son's hair. "And so long as I have breath, Henry, I will not fail you." And thus began the next chapter of her life. No longer the child bride, no longer merely the fragile widow, but a mother whose broken body could no longer bear children, yet whose unbroken spirit would one day bear the weight of a dynasty. The ink on Edmund Tudor's death was scarcely dry when whispers began to coil through the corridors of power. What shall become of his young widow? Margaret Beaufort was barely 14, a fragile wisp of a girl with hollow cheeks and a body still healing from the cruel ravages of childbirth. And yet she was also a Beaufort, the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, her blood laced with royal claim. More importantly, she was the mother of Edmund's son, Henry Tudor, heir to vast estates and perhaps to much more. In the brutal logic of the 15th century, her grief mattered little. Love, tenderness, and the sanctity of mourning were luxuries reserved for those without dynastic significance. For Margaret, widowhood was not an ending but a prelude. Already, her guardians and the King's Council schemed to bind her again in marriage, as though she were a pawn to be placed on another square of England's bloody chessboard. The choice fell upon Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of the Duke of Buckingham. At first glance, it seemed a modest match for a woman of Margaret's lineage. Stafford was no great lord, no warrior prince, but a man of practical means, his family's loyalty divided between Lancaster and York. Yet beneath this seeming ordinariness lay a careful calculation. With Stafford, Margaret would gain protection, stability, and a shield for her son. In these treacherous times, those gifts were worth far more than the illusions of passion or romance. And so, in 1458, barely a year after she had nearly died in childbirth, Margaret Beaufort was married again. The ceremony was simple, almost subdued. Gone were the trappings of her first marriage, when she had been paraded as a wealthy heiress, a prize to be claimed. This time, Margaret walked to the altar with eyes lowered, her body frail in its rich gown, her steps measured not by girlish excitement but by solemn resolve. The vows were spoken, the union sealed. And in that moment, Margaret understood the truth with crystalline clarity. This was not a marriage of hearts, but of necessity. Love had no place here. Survival did. In Stafford's household, Margaret found something unexpected, a measure of quiet. Sir Henry was neither cruel nor reckless. He did not press her beyond her fragile health, nor treat her with disdain. He offered companionship of a gentle, if distant, kind, an arrangement built less on affection than on mutual recognition of duty. To some, it might have seemed a meager existence, devoid of warmth. To Margaret, it was a reprieve. For the first time, she was not a bride trembling before a stranger's bed, nor a child widow mourning in isolation. She was a mother, a woman learning to balance devotion to her son with the wary demands of political survival. And yet, she never forgot what had been taken from her. Her youthful dreams of love, of choice, of agency in her own life. They had been buried with Edmund, with the innocence of her body shattered by Henry's birth. At night, as she prayed in the chapel, she wrestled with God. Is this all my life shall be, Lord? To bend, to endure, to sacrifice. And though no voice answered her, Margaret felt within herself a quiet conviction. Yes, she would endure. But not for nothing. Her suffering was not the end of her story. It was the soil in which a greater purpose was taking root. Her second marriage might lack passion, but it gave her what she needed most: survival, protection, and time. Time to heal. Time to plan. Time to ensure that her son Henry would live. The Wars of the Roses raged on around her. Lancaster and York tore at one another, each battle reshaping the fortunes of every noble house in England. At times, Stafford leaned toward Yorkist sympathies, seeking stability. Margaret, bound by her Beaufort blood and her son's Lancastrian claim, leaned toward Lancaster. Yet she learned, slowly and painfully, to temper her fervor. To flare openly as a partisan was to risk destruction. To speak too boldly of Henry's rights was to invite ruin. Instead, she cloaked her ambition beneath the guise of obedience, presenting herself as meek, dutiful, pious. Behind the veil of submission, her mind sharpened. It was in these years that Margaret began to master the delicate art of survival. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned how to cloak her true intentions in the soft language of faith. She learned to navigate the treacherous dance of shifting loyalties, adapting to the storms of fortune while never surrendering her inner compass. Henry was her compass. Always Henry. Whenever her heart faltered, she returned to the memory of his infant face, the weight of his small body against her breast. That child, fragile, innocent, yet destined for more, was her living prayer. If she could endure loveless marriage, if she could sacrifice her own desires, if she could bow her head in silence while others schemed, then perhaps one day, Henry might rise above it all. There were moments, rare but piercing, when she longed for the tenderness of love. She was, after all, still scarcely more than a girl, her heart not immune to the ache of loneliness. Watching other wives laugh softly with their husbands, she sometimes felt the pang of what she had been denied. But each time she forced herself to turn away. Love was a luxury. Duty was her destiny. And in choosing duty, she became something far greater than a victim of circumstance. She became a strategist in her own right, a woman who could bend but not break, who could trade her own happiness for the future of her son. Years later, when Henry Tudor would ascend the throne as King Henry VII, chroniclers would struggle to define his mother. Was she pious or ruthless? Submissive or shrewd? Saintly or calculating? The truth was that Margaret Beaufort was all of these things at once. She had learned, through the crucible of her second marriage, that survival often demanded the sacrifice of personal joy, that to preserve her son, she had to smother her own heart's longings. It was not romance that sustained her. It was resilience. And so Margaret lived her second marriage quietly, faithfully, outwardly docile. But within, her spirit smoldered. She would bow, she would endure, she would accept survival above love. Because in her silence, in her patience, she was preparing for the day when her son would no longer need her to survive in shadows, when he would step into the light, carrying the crown of England upon his brow. Until then, Margaret Beaufort would sacrifice everything: comfort, joy, even love itself. For Henry. Always for Henry. England burned. Not with fire alone, but with the fury of divided loyalties, rival banners, and ceaseless bloodshed. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York clashed again and again, soaking fields with the blood of fathers, brothers, and sons. For Margaret Beaufort, these wars were more than the distant thunder of politics. They were storms that threatened the fragile life of her only child, Henry Tudor. Every clash between armies shifted the ground beneath her feet, each victory or defeat shaping the possibility of his survival. The rival claims to England's throne had roots that tangled deep in royal blood. Margaret's own descent from John of Gaunt placed her inextricably within this web. But her line, the Beauforts, had been barred by ancient decree from ever inheriting the crown. Still, in Margaret's heart, hope smoldered. She believed, with the certainty of faith, that her son Henry was not born by accident, that his existence in this brutal age carried meaning, that God himself had marked the boy for something greater than mere survival. But to reach that destiny, Margaret would have to keep him alive while the realm devoured itself. The battles came swiftly and mercilessly. At St. Albans, blood flowed in the narrow streets. At Towton, in 1461, a blizzard swirled around soldiers locked in one of the deadliest clashes ever fought on English soil. Thousands were cut down, their bodies left in frozen heaps. Mothers wept for sons who would never return, widows for husbands who lay unburied in the snow. From her household, Margaret watched the news arrive in fragments. Letters, whispers, messengers riding through the night. Each new report was like a stone upon her chest. One day Lancaster triumphed, the next York rose stronger. There was no certainty, no ground firm enough to rest her hopes upon. And in the chaos, Margaret's second husband, Sir Henry Stafford, tried to steer a cautious course. Stafford leaned toward the Yorkist king, Edward IV, whose rise after Towton had cemented the White Rose's dominance. It was a choice born not of passion but pragmatism. Edward was powerful, handsome, charismatic, a ruler who seemed destined to hold the throne. Margaret, though bound by duty to her husband, felt the sting of this alignment. Her blood, her son's inheritance, her very identity, these were Lancastrian to the core. Her heart whispered loyalty to the Red Rose, even as her household bore outward signs of allegiance to the White. Yet she did not protest. Margaret had learned that to survive, one must sometimes bow to the storm. To rage openly was to risk ruin. To bend, silently and patiently, was to endure. And endurance was her greatest weapon. Still, her thoughts were never far from Henry. By now, her boy had grown into a quiet, observant child. His eyes followed her with solemn watchfulness, as though he too sensed the precariousness of their position. Margaret prayed over him nightly, her hands clasped tightly, her whispered words mingling with tears. Lord, keep him safe. Let not the swords of men or the hatred of kings fall upon him. Spare him for the purpose you have ordained. Each day the wars raged on, Margaret feared the knock at her door, the news that Lancaster's heirs had been cut down, and that her son's blood claim might draw the executioner's blade to his young neck. The conflict was more than battlefield slaughter. It seeped into every corner of life. Villages were plundered, crops destroyed, churches desecrated. Nobles shifted loyalties like leaves blown by the wind, swearing oaths one year, betraying them the next. Margaret moved carefully through the shifting landscape, a figure of piety and patience. Outwardly, she was a dutiful wife to Stafford, a woman who accepted the Yorkist king. Inwardly, she guarded her son's Lancastrian flame. It was a delicate balance, and one misstep could destroy them both. Yet the war showed Margaret something she had not fully grasped before: the fragility of kings. Edward IV seemed invincible, yet even his reign trembled under rebellion. Henry VI, Lancaster's broken king, returned for a fleeting moment to the throne, only to be toppled once again. Queens, nobles, bishops, none were safe from fortune's cruelty. Margaret saw it all and understood. Power was not eternal. Thrones shifted. Banners fell. Bloodlines endured only if someone had the will to preserve them. That someone, for her son, was her. The years between 1461 and 1470 were a crucible. Margaret endured raids on estates, shifting tides of allegiance, and the constant gnaw of uncertainty. Stafford himself was wounded at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, lingering for months before succumbing to death. Once again, Margaret found herself a widow. But this time, she was no longer the frightened girl of 13. She was hardened by loss, sharpened by years of watching England torn apart. She had buried dreams of love and comfort. What remained was iron resolve. Widowhood, war, and faith had forged her into something formidable. As the 1470s unfolded, Margaret watched Edward IV strengthen his throne. York held dominance once more, but she did not despair. She had seen how swiftly fortune turned. The realm was aflame, yes, but flames could cleanse as well as destroy. Out of this chaos, she believed, God was preparing a path. Not for Lancaster as it had been, nor for York, but for something new. For Henry. Margaret's faith became her fortress. Where others saw only ruin, she saw divine design. Each battle, each betrayal, each death, it was all part of a tapestry she could not yet see in full. She would bide her time. She would endure. And when the moment came, when the roses had exhausted themselves in endless war, her son would rise. Not as the pawn of Lancaster, nor as a token of York, but as England's answer to the realm's long suffering. And so, amid the roar of battle and the smoke of burning villages, Margaret Beaufort waited. She prayed. She endured. The wars of the roses might set the realm in flames, but she would carry her son through the fire. The spring of 1471 broke England's fragile hope in two. Lancaster, once thought extinguished, had risen again under the indomitable Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible that the Red Rose might reclaim the crown. Margaret Beaufort, ever watchful, dared to believe that God's justice might at last restore Henry VI and secure her own son's future. But war is a merciless judge. At Barnet, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, fell, his body left in the mud. And at Tewkesbury, Lancaster's final stand collapsed. Prince Edward of Westminster, the last direct heir of Henry VI, was cut down before he could even lift his father's crown. In the Tower of London, the broken Henry VI was quietly murdered. With those deaths, the House of Lancaster was shattered. Its branches severed, its future reduced to embers. And in that smoke and ruin, Margaret Beaufort understood a truth so stark it chilled her to the bone. Her son Henry was now the last hope of Lancaster. For Edward IV, triumphant under York's banner, this truth could not be ignored. He knew that to allow Henry Tudor to live was to leave a spark that might one day ignite rebellion. Henry was only a boy of 14, yet already he bore the dangerous inheritance of royal blood. His mother's lineage tied him to John of Gaunt, and though the Beaufort line had once been barred from succession, desperate men might rally around any claim when hope was scarce. Edward's net was tightening. Margaret, perceiving the danger, clutched her son's hands and pressed them to her heart. In those last moments before separation, she whispered fervent words. God's hand is upon you, Henry. You must live whatever the cost. Live, and one day he will show you why. And so, in the aftermath of Tewkesbury, Henry fled. Under cover of night, with trusted guardians guiding him, the boy who carried Lancaster's final thread slipped away from the realm that wanted him dead. Across the sea he sailed, to the rugged, uncertain safety of Brittany. The Channel waters bore him farther and farther from the land of his birth, from the mother who had carried him through danger and grief, from every familiar stone of Pembroke and every whispered prayer at her bedside. When the shores of France appeared on the horizon, Henry was no longer simply a child. He was an exile. For Margaret, the separation was a wound deeper than any sword could cut. She had endured widowhood, the death of kings, the shattering of dynasties. Yet nothing pierced her so cruelly as the knowledge that her only child, her purpose, her very soul, was beyond her reach. At night she lay awake, her rosary clutched tight, imagining his face. Was he cold in a foreign land? Was he afraid, surrounded by strangers? Did he remember the prayers she had spoken over him? Her maternal heart raged against the distance, but her faith bound her to hope. If God had preserved Henry through birth, through wars, through plots and peril, then surely he would preserve him still. In Brittany, Henry lived not as a prince, nor as a prisoner, but in a strange twilight between. The Duke of Brittany, Francois II, recognized the boy's value. He would not deliver him to Edward IV, but neither would he grant him true freedom. Henry was watched, guarded, and moved from castle to castle. Yet even in that cage of courtesy, Henry's presence carried weight. To the weary supporters of Lancaster scattered across Europe, whispers began, "The boy lives." Letters passed in secret, promises of allegiance smoldered, and the dream of restoration refused to die. For Margaret, every scrap of news that reached her was a lifeline. She treasured each word from across the sea, each rumor that her son was growing tall, thoughtful, cautious. He was becoming a man, and though fate had exiled him, she believed destiny still waited in England's soil. Edward IV tightened his grip on power. York seemed unshakable. Yet Margaret did not despair. She had learned that kings might rise like the morning sun only to be eclipsed in an instant. She had also learned patience. Her role now was not to fight on battlefields but to weave threads of alliance, to cultivate trust in quiet places, to keep alive the vision of Henry's return. She moved carefully among England's great lords, presenting herself not as a schemer, but as a pious widow, a dutiful subject, a woman whose strength was hidden beneath humility. But beneath that cloak of meekness beat a heart of steel. Her son was far away, but her will reached across the Channel. Years slipped by, and Henry grew into manhood in exile. The boy who had fled at 14 became a man of 20, then 25, still waiting, still watching. His life was a long apprenticeship in patience and caution. For Margaret, those years were a constant ache. She missed his voice, the feel of his hand in hers, the sight of him kneeling at her side in prayer. Yet she transformed her sorrow into faith. If separation was her cross, she would bear it. If exile was Henry's path, she would trust it was part of God's design. And so, with every Mass, every whispered rosary, every candle lit in the silence of her chamber, she prayed the same prayer. Preserve him, O Lord. Make him strong. And bring him home in your time. The Wars of the Roses had scattered Lancaster's line like ash upon the wind. But Margaret Beaufort believed ash could feed the soil, that out of ruin could rise new life. Henry's exile was not an ending. It was preparation. And though mother and son were parted by sea, by politics, by danger itself, their bond endured, unbroken, unyielding, sustained by faith. The boy who had fled would one day return. And when he did, the realm would remember the name of Henry Tudor. By the mid-1470s, England's crown seemed secure upon the brow of Edward IV. York's triumph at Tewkesbury had shattered Lancaster's hopes, and Margaret Beaufort, though still quietly loyal to the Red Rose, appeared to the world as nothing more than a pious widow. Yet Margaret had never been one to surrender to despair. If she could not wield power with an army, she would wield it with alliances. And in a realm fractured by ambition and suspicion, there was no stronger shield than marriage. In 1472, Margaret took a decisive step that startled even her closest companions. She married again, not for love, nor for companionship, but for survival and strategy. Her new husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord High Constable of England, one of the wealthiest and most politically astute men in the kingdom. Stanley was no ordinary noble. He was a man who thrived in uncertainty, whose strength lay in never committing too deeply to one side or the other. The Wars of the Roses had shown him the danger of loyalty to a single banner. Instead, he perfected the art of neutrality, supporting York when it was strong, Lancaster when it was useful, and himself above all else. In this, he was Margaret's opposite. Her heart and loyalty belonged solely to her son and his future. Yet, strange as it seemed, their differences made the match advantageous. For Margaret, Stanley's power offered protection. With him at her side, she was no longer the vulnerable widow of Edmund Tudor, nor the mother of a Lancastrian exile. She was now the wife of one of England's most influential lords, shielded beneath his political shadow. For Stanley, Margaret was a curious choice. She brought neither great estates nor the promise of children. Her body, weakened by Henry's birth, could bear no more heirs. Yet Stanley was a man who measured value differently. In Margaret, he found not only a woman of sharp intellect and devout reputation, but also a connection to the royal bloodline, through her son. To others, Henry Tudor was a fugitive boy across the sea. To Margaret, and increasingly to Stanley, he was a card worth keeping close to the chest. Their marriage was not one of tenderness. There were no whispers of passion in its halls, no soft letters of longing between them. Stanley lived often at court, close to Edward IV, while Margaret resided in her estates, devoting herself to prayer, charity, and the quiet nurturing of her son's distant cause. Yet beneath the surface, a partnership of calculation formed. Margaret understood that Stanley's shifting loyalties made him unpredictable, but she also understood the power in having him bound, however loosely, to her. She could not fight for Henry on battlefields, but she could weave his claim into the great web of England's politics, strand by strand. Stanley's vast influence, his men, his wealth, his ability to stand near the throne without falling beneath it, was a resource Margaret could not ignore. If her son ever returned, Stanley's support could tip the scales of war. And Stanley, careful as ever, saw in Margaret a woman whose unyielding faith might one day be vindicated. If fortune changed, if York's crown slipped, if Lancaster's flame flickered back to life, He would already be positioned at the heart of it. Margaret wore her new role like armor. At court, she played the part of the dutiful wife, gracious and humble. Yet in her private chapels, before her crucifix and rosary, her prayers burned with greater fire. O Lord, keep my son safe in his exile. Let my marriage be more than a shield. Let it be the bridge that one day brings him home. In truth, her marriage to Stanley was less about joining hearts than about joining survival. It was a pact between pragmatists, one who lived for her son, the other who lived for power. But Margaret knew something Stanley did not. She believed with every fiber of her being that Henry's destiny was real, that God had preserved him not to die forgotten in Brittany, but to rise. And if that day came, Thomas Stanley's cautious hands would not be able to sit idle. He would be forced to choose. For Margaret, that choice was clear already. Every prayer, every decision, every breath she took was for her son. The marriage bound her outwardly to Stanley, but inwardly she remained bound to Henry, and to the dream of a crown. Thus, Margaret Beaufort stepped into a new chapter of her life, no longer a widowed lady at the mercy of greater powers, but a woman who, through the careful union with Thomas Stanley, had secured her place at the very crossroads of England's fate. And in that place she waited, for the moment when fortune, faith, and her son's destiny would converge. In the spring of 1483, England was thrown into turmoil. Edward IV, the towering king who had ruled with strength and excess, was suddenly dead. His heir, the young Edward V, was only 12 years old, a boy not yet ready for the weight of the crown. At once, the kingdom became a chessboard, and every noble a player. And few played with sharper intent than Margaret Beaufort. For years, Margaret had endured the role of a sidelined mother. Her son Henry, now grown, still lived in exile in Brittany, watched constantly, his every movement shadowed by suspicion. To the Yorkist crown, he was a threat. To Margaret, he was destiny. Edward IV's death cracked open the order of things. Suddenly, the throne no longer seemed unshakable. With a child king and factions forming around him, Margaret saw not just opportunity, but divine providence. And so, she made her most daring gamble. At court, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's brother, moved quickly. He seized custody of young Edward V, declaring himself Lord Protector. Yet whispers soon swirled that Gloucester intended not to protect his nephew, but to take the crown for himself. The rumors proved true. By summer, Edward V and his younger brother were locked in the Tower of London. Richard declared them illegitimate and crowned himself Richard III. For many, this was shocking. For Margaret, it was a turning point. She saw Richard's usurpation for what it was: tyranny clothed in legality. The princes vanished into the Tower's shadows, never to be seen again. And though the nation held its breath in dread, Margaret's heart leapt with conviction. The York line was poisoned. Edward's sons were gone. Richard had no secure claim. Who, then, was left? Her son, Henry Tudor. It was in these days that Margaret revealed her political genius. While others trembled, she began weaving alliances in secret, drawing together nobles who loathed Richard's cruelty. She whispered promises, nurtured hopes, and above all, pointed to Henry as the rightful heir, through his descent from John of Gaunt and the Beaufort line. Yet she knew blood alone was not enough. Henry needed more than a claim. He needed legitimacy that all of England could rally behind. And so Margaret conceived her boldest gamble of all. She proposed to unite the feuding Roses. Her son, Henry, would marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. In that union, Lancaster and York would become one house, one crown. It was audacious. It was dangerous. But it was brilliant. In hidden chambers, Margaret spoke with Elizabeth Woodville, the Dowager Queen and mother of the lost princes. Both women had been stripped of power. Both had children cast aside by Richard's rise. Together they forged a pact. Elizabeth would give her daughter to Henry, and Margaret would give England a king who could heal its wounds. In those hushed hours, Margaret's gamble became a vision of reconciliation. Not just Lancaster triumphant, nor York restored, but something greater, a kingdom united at last. But every step carried peril. Richard's spies prowled, watching every move. Discovery meant ruin, not just for Margaret but for Henry. Yet she pressed on, her faith unbroken. To her confessor she once murmured, "If it be God's will, my son shall wear the crown. If I perish in the attempt, let it be known I perished as a mother who trusted in his promise." Thus Margaret Beaufort, the frail woman long dismissed as a pious widow, emerged as a master of destiny. With no sword in her hand, she wielded alliances sharper than steel. With no army at her back, she moved kings and queens like pieces upon a board. Her gamble was immense, placing her son as the only hope for a fractured realm. If she failed, Henry would remain a forgotten exile, or worse, a dead pretender. But if she succeeded, the roses would be bound together in her son's crown. And so, in the shadow of Richard III's usurpation, Margaret Beaufort placed everything on a single hope: her son, Henry. A mother's gamble against a king. The summer of 1485 was heavy with fate. For 2 long years, Margaret Beaufort had schemed and prayed, binding her hopes to her son's distant exile. Now, at last, the moment had come. Henry Tudor, her only child, her exile-born heir, set sail from Brittany with a modest force. His banner bore the red dragon of Cadwallader, the ancient symbol of Welsh kingship. But beneath it lay a deeper promise. Margaret's promise that God himself had chosen him to end the blood-soaked wars and heal England. On August 22, 1485, in the fields near Bosworth, destiny took form. Richard III, hardened by battle, rode into the fray with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He charged directly at Henry, determined to end the Tudor threat with his own hand. The clash was desperate, brutal, the kind of moment where the crown itself hangs by a breath. And then came the turn. Margaret's husband, Thomas Stanley, long cautious, long calculating, finally moved. His troops swung their weight behind Henry at the crucial moment. Betrayed, Richard was dragged from his horse and cut down in the mud, crying, it was said, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" When the dust settled, the Yorkist king lay dead upon the field, and Henry Tudor was crowned with a circlet plucked from a bush. The Wars of the Roses were over. But Margaret's role did not end at Bosworth. It had only begun. Her son, now Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses in one crown. The very gamble Margaret had sown in whispers years before had come to fruition. The Tudors were no longer exiles, no longer pawns. They were rulers of England. And Margaret Beaufort, once a girl widow, once a powerless mother, was the silent architect of it all. Unlike queens of the past, she did not fade into the shadows. Margaret styled herself not as a mere dowager, but as "my lady, the king's mother." She walked a path few women had dared, ruling from behind the throne, guiding her son with counsel, and shaping the policies of the new dynasty. It was she who oversaw the education of her grandchildren, ensuring that learning and piety defined the Tudor court. It was she who endowed colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, her faith etched into England's intellectual life. Though she never wore a crown, Margaret wielded influence greater than many queens. And yet, beneath her power and triumph, there always lingered the memory of her broken body, her lost girlhood, her long years of waiting. She had known what it was to be powerless. She had known despair. But through faith, cunning, and relentless resolve, she had transformed her suffering into the seed of a dynasty. When she died in 1509, just days after her grandson Henry VIII's coronation, England paused to mourn her. At her funeral, the scholar John Fisher spoke of her as a woman of singular wisdom, constancy, and devotion. A woman who had once been a child bride, a bereaved widow, a pawn of war, yet rose to become the mother of England's greatest dynasty. Thus ends the story of Margaret Beaufort, a girl who bore a king at 13, a widow who endured in silence, a mother who gambled against a tyrant, and a matriarch who gave England the Tudors. Through her, the roses were bound together. Through her, the wars ended. Through her, history itself was rewritten, not with a sword in her hand, but with a mother's unbroken faith.